June 12, 1943. 24,000 feet above the Pas-de-Calais. The cold air knifes through the cockpit seams of Captain Robert Hayes's P-47 as the thunder of his Pratt & Whitney R. 2800 engine vibrates through the control stick. Frost clings to the edges of his canopy, framing his narrowed eyes. Below him, the cloud deck ripples like steel wool under the morning sun. The radio crackles with distant chatter from the bomber's stream ahead. His Thunderbolt patrol arcs above them, ready to intercept any German fighters rising from the airfields along the coast. A faint shimmer cuts across the horizon. Hayes tilts the nose slightly. Twin specks glide against the light. Moments later, they separate into the sharp silhouettes of two Bf-109Gs rising fast. The Luftwaffe pilots are confident. They have seen the American heavy fighter before. Word had spread through Gruppen briefings that the new USAAF machine is too big, too heavy, and too sluggish to pose a serious threat. Some pilots joked that it climbed like a barn door strapped to a tractor. But Hayes knows something they do not. The lead 109 angles upward in a rising attack, sunlight winking off its wing root cannon. Hayes hears his heartbeat punch against his oxygen mask. He grips the throttle and eases the stick forward, preparing for the one maneuver he knows the Germans cannot match. The 109 closes rapidly. The wind whips past the canopy as rounds stitch the air above him. The moment the tracers flash overhead, Hayes shoves the nose down, and the P-47 drops like a stone. The engine roars as the turbo supercharger spools. The altimeter unwinds in a blur. Hayes feels his vision tighten as the dive steepens and the airframe begins to tremble with the edge of compressibility. The Thunderbolt groans, but holds firm. The dive speed surges past anything a German airframe can safely endure at this altitude. Hayes watches the 109 struggling to follow. Its wings flutter under the strain. The pilot wrenches back, but the fighter begins to buffet violently. Hayes sees the unmistakable moment of panic as the German breaks off, unable to continue the pursuit. The P-47 slices through the cloud deck, trailing vapor. Hayes steadies the stick, letting the aircraft recover smoothly. He skims over the gray sea of clouds, knowing the sky above has shifted. The German pilots who once mocked his aircraft have just learned the first truth about the Thunderbolt. It can fall faster than any plane they fly, and no amount of bravado can change that. The truth Hayes demonstrated in that dive had its roots years earlier in the factories and wind tunnels of Republic aviation. In 1940, engineers under Alexander Kartveli wrestled with a challenge no American fighter had yet solved. They needed an aircraft that could operate at high altitude alongside heavy bombers while carrying a massive engine, heavy armament, and enough fuel to cross the channel and return. The design sketches grew larger and heavier with every revision until even Hus. The test pilots joked that the new model looked more like a short-winged tank than a fighter. Kartveli refused to compromise. He insisted on pairing the enormous R-2800 engine with a ducted turbo supercharger system that filled the entire lower fuselage with piping, intercoolers, and vents. The frame that housed all of this equipment required thick spars and reinforced bulkheads. Every addition pushed the weight higher. The prototype XP-47B rolled onto the tarmac in 1941 with a loaded weight far beyond anything American pilots expected to fly as a single-seat fighter. Early flights confirmed both the promise and the problems. The aircraft climbed slower than expected, and the large fuselage created significant drag. On the ground, it looked ungainly, its wide landing gear straddling the concrete like a guard dog ready to pounce. But once in the air, the test pilots discovered something unnerving. The airframe was incredibly strong. They pushed it through high-speed dives that would have torn the wings off earlier fighters. The Thunderbolt could survive stresses that seemed impossible for a machine of its size. While American engineers refined the design, the Luftwaffe gathered scraps of intelligence from reconnaissance photos and pilot reports. German analysts studying grainy silhouettes concluded that the Americans had built a heavy escort fighter unsuited for agile combat. Their memos described it as overweight, slow climbing, and easy to outmaneuver. Luftwaffe pilots read those assessments during briefings and accepted them without question. Many laughed when they first saw the bulky American fighter lumbering alongside bomber formations. By late 1942, USAAF units in England began receiving their first operational P-47s. Pilots stepping up to the cockpit faced a maze of gauges, turbo controls, and a massive four-bladed propeller that towered above their heads. Lieutenant Frank Tolley from the 4th Fighter Group recalled how veterans fresh from flying P-51As and Spitfire 5s were stunned by the Thunderbolt's size. On the first day of conversion training, several pilots admitted privately that they worried the aircraft was too cumbersome for combat over Europe. Yet flight instructors reminded them of one lesson above all others. Speed in a dive was their weapon. They emphasized that the aircraft's thick wings, heavy fuselage, and robust construction allowed it to enter steep descents at speeds no German machine could match. Every new pilot learned that if a fight turned downward, the Thunderbolt would survive long after an enemy airframe began to disintegrate. As the winter of 1943 passed into spring, operational squadrons carried those lessons into combat. German patrols continued to underestimate the American fighter based solely on its appearance and early performance at altitude. But each skirmish revealed more of the truth. If the P-47 gained height, it became a predator. If it dropped into a dive, it became nearly untouchable. The stage was set for a series of encounters that would overturn every assumption the Luftwaffe held about the Thunderbolt. The next months would transform the aircraft from a ridiculed newcomer into a lethal presence the Germans struggled to counter. March 10, 1943. 14,000 feet above the Dutch coast, a formation of B-17s pushes inland, their engines droning in rhythmic unison as condensation trails curl off their wings. Ahead of them, the sky darkens with the shapes of enemy fighters rising from their bases east of Groningen. The Thunderbolts of the 56th Fighter Group sweep in from the west, climbing steadily to take position above the bombers. Among them is Lieutenant Jack Dorr, flying his newly assigned P-47C, with its polished fuselage glinting beneath the pale northern sun. Dorr feels the tension through the gloves, gripping his control stick. This will be his squadron's first major engagement since receiving updated instructions from their group commander. They are to hold altitude, strike from above, and refuse low-speed turning fights where the lighter German fighters excel. Their advantage is height, weight, and the immense force the airframe can absorb in a high-speed descent. A warning cuts across the radio. Bandits approaching from 2 o'clock low. Dorr angles his canopy toward the call and sees a swarm of black specks arcing upward. FJ-90As, climbing fast and confident. Their radial engines leave faint trails as they tighten toward the bomber stream. The German leader banks sharply, leading his Staffel in a climbing arc designed to meet the Thunderbolts head-on. Dorr hears his flight lead, Captain Merrick, issue a single crisp order. Hit them from above. No turns, no dogfighting, slashing passes only. The 4 Thunderbolts roll inverted as one and dive toward the German formation. The sky fills with wind as the P-47s plunge forward. Dorr feels the controls stiffen, the airframe pressing hard against him as the dive steepens. His gun sight drops across the lead FU-190. The Germans see the attack too late. Their upward charge puts them directly in the path of the falling Thunderbolts. Dorr squeezes the trigger, and his .850 caliber guns erupt in a steady stream of fire that slices through the air like a glowing saw. Tracers rake across the wings of the lead FW-190 before it barrels away, trailing smoke. The remaining German fighters scatter, surprised by both the speed and the violence of the American attack. The Thunderbolts streak past and pull out several thousand feet below. Dorr feels the deep rumble of compressibility tugging at his wings, but the aircraft holds firm. He levels out and climbs gently, letting the turbo supercharger feed the engine as the fighter regains altitude. Above him, the bombers continue their slow eastward crawl. The German fighters regroup, now circling cautiously. Merrick's voice cuts in again. "Stay high. Hit again. No turning." The squadron climbs back into position. The Germans try a new tactic, diving from behind the bombers to draw the Thunderbolts into horizontal combat, where maneuverability matters. But the American pilots refuse to fall for it. Instead, Dorr and his wingman swing wide, gaining altitude before rolling into another high-speed attack. This time, the Germans attempt to follow. An FW-190 peels off and dives after Dorr, trying to catch him during his descent. Dorr pushes the throttle forward and commits to the dive. The P-47 picks up speed instantly. The airframe shudders but remains solid, the heavy wings biting through the air. The German fighter accelerates behind him, its pilot pushing his machine into territory it was never designed to enter. Dorr watches through the mirror as the FW-190 begins to tremble violently. Its wingtips flutter like torn fabric. The German pilot tries to pull out, but the airframe begins to twist under the stress. A single puff of smoke bursts from the cowling. Then the fighter snaps into a sudden, uncontrolled roll and disappears into the clouds below. Dorr levels out again, his heartbeat pounding against his chest. He has just witnessed the unspoken truth of the Thunderbolt's design. When pushed to the edge of structural endurance, only one fighter in Europe can survive the fall, and it is the one he is flying. That mission ends with the bombers returning home with fewer losses than expected. Reports later confirm multiple German aircraft destroyed or damaged during failed pursuits. For the first time, American pilots begin to understand that their supposed disadvantage is in fact a devastating weapon. And German commanders begin to question their assumptions. April 5th, 1943. Dawn mist clings to the runways at Horsham St. Faith as ground crews move between rows of Thunderbolts, preparing for another escort mission. The faint smell of fuel hangs over the field, while armorers feed belts of .50 caliber ammunition into the wing bays. Captain Merrick walks beneath the towering propeller of his P-47, listening to the distant rumble of engines warming across the dispersal. He has spent the past month drilling his squadron relentlessly. Altitude first, speed always, attack with momentum, and leave before the enemy can drag the fight horizontal. By now, the pilots of the 56th Fighter Group have absorbed the lesson that changed everything. The Thunderbolt's sheer mass, once mocked, is a weapon. The airframe can endure the crushing pressures of near transonic descent. The German fighters cannot. And so each morning, Merrick reminds his men that survival and victory depend on controlling the vertical axis. By mid-morning, the squadron climbs through scattered clouds over the English Channel. The sky is crisp and cold, the sun rising behind them like a pale beacon. Lieutenant Dorr glances at his gauges. Oil temp steady, turbo pressure holding. The big radial engine hums with a deep vibration that resonates through the cockpit floor. Ahead of the squadron, the B-17s form a long silver chain, stretching toward occupied Europe. They cross the Dutch coast at 21,000 feet. The radio remains quiet, except for the occasional position update. But the stillness never lasts. Minutes later, contrails appear above the bombers, thin lines cutting downward from even higher altitude. German fighters have the advantage of height this time. Dorr counts at least a dozen Bf-109Gs diving fast, their noses pointed directly at the bomber boxes. Merrick reacts instantly. All flights climb. Deny them the advantage. The Thunderbolts nose upward, engines straining as the air thins. The German formation sweeps past the bombers and tries to latch onto the American fighters. A pair of WWIIs angle toward Dorr's element, banking hard to force a turning engagement. Dorr refuses. Instead, he continues upward, adding precious seconds of altitude. The Germans follow, expecting the heavy Thunderbolt to stall in the climb. But Dorr waits until the WWIIs close the distance. Then he rolls sharply and shoves the nose forward. The P-47 drops like a hammer, its speed rising in a heartbeat. The Germans react too late. One tries to follow and instantly enters a steep dive that pushes the limits of its slender wings. The airframe shakes violently. Dorr watches it falling behind him, the gap widening with every passing second. Ahead of him, Captain Merrick positions his own flight for a slashing pass against a scattered group of FW-190s regrouping at mid-altitude. Merrick leads the dive, guns blazing, his tracers cutting through the morning air. One German fighter disintegrates under the burst, pieces spiraling as the pilot ejects into open sky. The rest scatter, attempting to drag the Thunderbolts into turning fights. But none of Merrick's men accept the bait. They climb, regroup, and dive again like predators striking from a higher branch. Farther east, another skirmish unfolds. Lieutenant Sam Ritter from B Flight chases a lone FW-190 diving away from the bombers. Ritter remembers the instructions drilled into him. Do not chase unless you have the angle. He climbs instead, letting the German pilot believe he has escaped. The FW-190 levels off, then begins a gentle turn, unaware of the danger above. Ritter seizes the moment, rolls into a controlled dive, and cuts across the Germans' flight path with overwhelming speed. 8 guns rip through the fighter's fuselage, and the aircraft bursts into flames before spinning toward the fields below. Word of these encounters spreads quickly among Luftwaffe units. By late spring, German pilots quietly admit that the Thunderbolt cannot be fought on its terms. Squadron leaders instruct their men to avoid following the American fighter into steep dives. But combat rarely gives such choices. In the chaos of defending Germany's industrial corridor, many pilots act on instinct. And instinct often pushes them to chase a fleeing enemy downward. Each time they do, the result is the same. The 109 or 190 begins to tremble. The wings flex. Panels tear loose. Ailerons flutter. Sometimes the pilot pulls out in time. Often, he does not. As April turns into May, USAAF intelligence officers note a subtle shift in German radio intercepts. Luftwaffe pilots no longer mock the Thunderbolt. Instead, they warn each other. Do not follow the heavy American fighter downward. It dives too fast. It is too strong. It will kill you. By the start of summer, the Americans have mastered a tactic that no German design can safely counter. With altitude and discipline, the P-47 is becoming a force that shapes the very geometry of aerial combat over Europe. June 22, 1943. 30,000 feet above Bremen. The air is thin and biting cold. The sunlight sharp enough to shimmer across the aluminum skins of hundreds of B-17s pushing toward the city's sprawling factories below. The bombers crawl forward in tight combat boxes, each formation wrapped in the rhythmic thunder of synchronized engines. Above and behind them, the Thunderbolts of the 56th, 353rd, and 5th Fighter Groups weave in broad arcs, a shield of silver specks guarding the lumbering giants beneath. Lieutenant Dorr adjusts his oxygen mask as frost creeps along the inside corners of his canopy. The engine's deep vibration pulses through his boots. He scans the horizon with narrowed eyes. This altitude belongs to the Thunderbolt. Its turbo supercharger breathes life into the engine where German fighters struggle for power. The Luftwaffe knows this, and yet they must attack. The factories below cannot fall silent. Their survival depends on disrupting the bomber streams before they reach the target. A burst of static crackles across the radio. Fighters inbound from the northeast. Dorr jerks his head toward the call and spots a loose formation of Bf-109Gs emerging from thin strands of cirrus cloud. Their engines strain at this height, leaving faint trails that flicker in the sunlight. The German pilots try to line up a diving attack on the bombers, but the Thunderbolts react immediately. Captain Merrick orders all flights to split high and pass over the 109s. The American fighters surge upward, climbing with deliberate precision. When they crest above the Germans, the sky transforms. The Thunderbolts roll sharply and descend in a coordinated wave. Their guns flare with bright streaks that cut across the pale sky. The German formation shatters under the attack. 109 spirals down, trailing a long plume of smoke. Another rolls violently before the pilot bails out, his parachute blooming like a white flower above the clouds. But the German attack is far from over. More fighters rise from the direction of Oldenburg, a mix of 109s and FW-190s attempting to mass for a concentrated strike. Dorr orders his wingman to hold close as they climb again, regaining the altitude lost in the dive. Below them, a few FW-190s try to break into the bomber formation from the side. Their engines cough in the thin air, struggling to maintain energy. The Thunderbolts dive once more. The heavy fighters descend with terrifying speed, their airframes slicing through the sky in long, controlled arcs. Lieutenant Ritter joins the strike from the right flank. He lines up on an FJ-190 diving toward the bombers. At this height, the German aircraft shivers from the strain. Ritter squeezes the trigger, and a steady burst tears through the enemy's tail section. The fighter bursts apart in a flash of debris. Ritter pulls out low, the airflow thickening as he descends into denser air. The P-47 responds with absolute steadiness. He climbs again, confident that the aircraft will hold through any maneuver he demands. Farther west, Captain Merrick watches a lone 109 trailing the bomber stream at mid-altitude. The German pilot seems desperate, trying to gain just enough height to take a shot. Merrick signals his flight, and they bank across the sky in a wide curve. The 109 senses the danger too late. The Thunderbolts dive from above, their combined fire blotting out the sky around him. The German fighter explodes in a black puff of smoke. The bombers reach the target moments later, releasing cascades of bombs that fall in long, glittering lines toward the factories below. Anti-aircraft bursts pepper the sky with dark blossoms, but the Thunderbolts hold formation, patrolling the upper air while the bombers make their turn for home. When the Luftwaffe attempts one final interception during the withdrawal, they attack from a lower altitude. It is a fatal mistake. The Thunderbolts drop from above like falling meteors. One German pilot attempts to evade by diving away. Dorr watches him try to hold the descent. The wings of the 109 begin to flutter. The nose shakes uncontrollably. Then the fighter snaps downward in a jagged plunge. Another victim of a chase he should never have attempted. By late afternoon, the American formation crosses back over the Dutch coast. The radios fill with weary but relieved voices. Bomber losses are significantly lower than expected. USAAF analysts later credit the Thunderbolts for breaking up at least 4 coordinated German attacks before they reach the bombers. Within the Luftwaffe command network, the tone has changed. Reports from Staffel leaders warn that the heavy American fighter is no longer a secondary threat. It is the primary obstacle preventing effective strikes on the bomber streams. Pilots confess privately that they dread facing the Thunderbolt above 20,000 feet. It is too fast in a dive, too strong under pressure, and too hard to shake once it commits to an attack. The aircraft, once mocked for its size, has become a predator that owns the vertical dimension of air combat. And with every mission, the fear grows louder in German briefings. Louder in German briefings. September 9th, 1944. Low clouds drift above the ruined hedgerows of eastern France as the front line creeps eastward toward the German border. The thunder of artillery echoes across the countryside. Columns of American armor grind along muddy roads, while infantry units advance through fields scorched by weeks of fighting. Overhead, the sky vibrates with the sound of radial engines. P-47 Thunderbolts, now flying in mixed fighter-bomber roles, crisscross the front in constant patrols. Lieutenant Dorr, older and harder than the young pilot who first learned to trust the heavy fighter, banks his P-47D over the remnants of a small French village. The air inside the cockpit tastes of oil and dust. Beneath him, a German armored column attempts to slip through a sunken road. Half-tracks weave between shattered buildings, their engines sputtering as they accelerate toward cover. Dorr radios his squadron and marks the target. He still carries 8 50 caliber guns, but the missions have changed. The Thunderbolt's belly now holds bombs, rockets, and new confidence in its ability to deliver destruction on the ground. He dives toward the column. The aircraft plummets with the same violent energy that once terrified German fighter pilots in the upper air. The wind howls across the canopy as he lines up the road beneath him. He releases his bombs and pulls up sharply. The shockwave ripples through his wings as the road erupts into fire and soil. He circles back. The rest of the squadron follows in staggered runs, rockets streaking downward and ripping through vehicles now scrambling to escape. On the German side, the transformation of the Thunderbolt is well known. In the spring of 1943, they feared its dive. By late 1944, they fear its shadow. Infantry units describe the aircraft as an anvil falling from the sky. Armor crews whisper that a single pass from the American fighter can turn a column into a smoking trail of wreckage. Even experienced Luftwaffe pilots, increasingly scarce and exhausted, warn their younger comrades that the heavy fighter they once mocked is one of the most dangerous machines still roaming the European theater. Higher in the sky, Dorr rejoins his element. The clouds part just enough to reveal a formation of WWIIs approaching from the northeast. Despite months of losses, the Germans continue to fight with reckless resolve. Their aircraft descend toward the American lines, attempting to strike at armored units massing near a ridge. Dorr signals his wingman and climbs to intercept. The Thunderbolt responds with the same unwavering strength it showed at 30,000 feet over Germany. The engine roars as the aircraft muscles upward through the mist. The 190s spot the Americans too late. Dorr rolls into a high-speed pass, squeezing the trigger as he cuts across the lead fighter's nose. The German pilot jerks away, his wings quivering from the force of the sudden maneuver. Another Thunderbolt dives past, firing a tight burst that shreds a second fighter's tail control surfaces. The German formation scatters, unable to hold cohesion in the face of the slashing American attacks. One desperate German fighter attempts a familiar escape. The pilot angles into a steep dive, hoping to break contact by plunging toward the treetops. But Dorr recognizes the pattern instantly. He follows, holding the dive only long enough to show the German pilot what he already knows. The 190's fuselage begins to tremble under the increasing pressure. Dorr eases out of the dive as the German fighter snaps into a violent roll. It vanishes into a spray of branches below. The fight ends quickly. The remaining German aircraft flee eastward, climbing for cloud cover. Dorr and his wingman pull away, the heavy fighters roaring back toward friendly territory. As they cross above the American lines, signal crews on the ground watch the massive Thunderbolts pass overhead. To them, the aircraft represents safety, power, certainty, a steel hammer striking wherever it is aimed. By winter, the Thunderbolt's reputation is ironclad. Luftwaffe intelligence reports describe it as nearly immune to high-speed failure. Ground commanders warn armored units to avoid traveling during daylight when Thunderbolts patrol. And among USAAF squadrons flying escort and ground attack missions, the earlier doubts have evaporated. The pilots now trust the aircraft completely. It climbs slowly, turns broadly, and burns fuel greedily. But it protects them with its rugged frame and answers every command in the dive. In the final months of the war, as German cities fall and the air war collapses around the Reich, one truth becomes clear among both sides. The fighter that once drew laughter in briefing rooms and dismissive glances over cockpits has become one of the most decisive weapons of the Allied air campaign. The Germans no longer mock the Thunderbolt. They fear it. They respect it. And in the end, they understand what American pilots learned high above the clouds in 1943. The P-47 Thunderbolt was never clumsy, never slow, never weak. It was a falling meteor, a sledgehammer from the sky, and when it dove, no plane in Europe could follow it and survive.